Hello and welcome to At the 55, your home for U Sports football. Me and Tom are back on the mics with a new installment of the Exit Meeting series. We are taking our talents back to La Belle Provence to talk a little Concordia Stingers football, the last of the teams, as Tom and I put it, that are been in the unknown section. So it's been great getting a deep dive, and we're going to talk about the season that was, some of the moves, some of the anticipated moves in the offseason time, combines, all that jazz, what's on the horizon for the team, and so much more. But first, Tom, how the heck are you doing, my friend?
I'm always doing so well, my man. Anytime we get to talk some U Sports football. And exactly like you said, the RSEQ for us is the hardest one to cover. A, because there's not a subscription service like the other teams are. And B, because TVA doesn't actually post the recordings after the games. So again, we're heavily reliant on stats for the most part. Now we still do our research and we've deep dove and everything else. So don't you worry, Stingers fans. We're not making excuses here, but that's what Zach is saying with the mystery team, as it were. We just haven't seen as much, and we're hoping that changes in the future here with some exciting potential news, but we'll see.
1000%. And, also shout out to our friends at Les Montagnards for giving us a little bit of insight.
Oui.
Merci beaucoup pour toujours nous aidons. No, that was bad. Anyhow, let's talk about this team. Concordia Stingers club that finished 3-5, made their way into the playoffs off the back of that buzzer beater against McGill to end the season off. We talked about that when we did the McGill breakdown, all the while leading them to a pretty heavy beatdown at the hands of the eventual Vanier Cup champions in the Montreal Carabins, a team that had beaten them twice pretty handedly during the regular season as well. So, Tom, again, as you alluded to, and for all those reasons about access to the TVA, the clips, and everything like that, a little harder to keep tabs on this team. And it's been a conference that has consistently, for quite a while, just been that two-dog race. It's great seeing what McGill did this year, having some of those really highlight plays, beating Montreal and all that. But it's a team where, like we've talked about with a number of clubs in those smaller conferences, really, in the RSEQ and the AUS, where it's like, look, there's a pretty established hierarchy of these are the teams that are going to duke it out for the top supremacy. And hey, you can say the same thing in the OUA year in, year out, where it's like, all right, look, this year Western and Laurier, and then Queens obviously pulled it off, but is in that, maybe they get you, and Guelph kind of that can get you. So actually, maybe the example doesn't hold true with the OUA. But the point I want to get to is with the AUS and the RSEQ, we see this over the last couple of years where it's like the two teams that were pretty darn confident are going to compete with it. So for the other clubs, what does a successful season mean to you? I want to throw that question to you because on the one hand, that McGill win is terrific. They get that third seed. That's awesome for this Concordia team. Some exciting players on this defense that we'll get into for sure. On the other hand, you drop a game to Sherbrooke earlier in the season, which is like, however much that factored into you losing to Montreal by like 50 in the first round doesn't really factor in. But in the story of the lane that you swim in within your conference, no, you got to win that game.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at the games in this one, and again, it is a two-dog race until it's not, for sure. But going into the season, looking at the RSEQ, we've detailed this before, there was a number of interesting games at that, I don't want to say lower tier, but with the rest of the RSEQ as well, because Concordia looked like they were going to be competing with McGill in terms of who was going to be in that number 3 spot, and then they drop the game to Sherbrooke directly after winning their home opener against McGill. And you're thinking, guys, like, you got to win every game you can in a team or in a league where if you're playing against Montreal or Laval twice, that's pretty much 4 losses right there. And you have to be able to win the rest of your games. But while the Montreal side of the equation obviously has been pretty bad. I mean, the first game was 41-14, the second one 52-2, and then the last one in the semifinals 51-2. Obviously not great. They actually played Laval much better. Obviously, the first loss 39-14, maybe not great, but their second 19-8 in Quebec City. And for a long while there, like Laval went off and they scored 16 points in the second quarter and then like scored a field goal in the third and nothing in the fourth. So if that offense can find a rhythm and if they can do something, Concordia has a chance to upset Laval in Quebec City, which is unheard of. But obviously, coulda, woulda, shoulda scenarios here. But if you're finding a rhythm with one of those two teams, that's obviously very, very encouraging here. But again, you've got to take advantage of every single game you have, and dropping that one to Sherbrooke first off in the season that's tough.
We're a number of weeks away from talking about Laval. I'm excited for that one because it was a weird year for the Rouge et Or because, I mean, they obviously dropped that first game to Montreal that, as we talked about in the moment, just came down to a couple of key bounces here when you're that close with a team. That pick six, I think, that Arnaud threw early.
Mm-hmm.
A couple really splashy plays by Pepe. But then as we talked about, like McGill put points up on them. Obviously, that first round playoff matchup is up on them big in the first quarter. And then it takes a 17-point fourth quarter effort to beat Sherbrooke at the end of the season. Look, Laval, this is going to be interesting because, you know, you got to find someone to replace Arnaud Desjardins, you know, arguably the best quarterback in Canada. And last year was a little, anyway, it's not the Laval pod, but you bring up the fact that they were in a close game with this team in Concordia that we're trying to understand. I'm like, it actually makes me think more about Laval a little bit. But if we may, I'd love to talk about this defense because it's a really exciting team. And we've seen the names of guys like Mendel Joseph being on the All-Canadian list and the numbers that he's put up that, again, when you talk to people that know RSEQ football, who know the program, that's offense, defense, special teams, one of the first names that comes up. Loic Gagné, a name that was really big throughout the last couple years. He's got the invite to the National Combine coming up in a few weeks, and a name that didn't cross my radar throughout the season, but I was stoked to see it come up in going through the roster. One, Christopher Searle, who is a former defensive back from the Ottawa Gee-Gees. And if you know one thing about the Ottawa Gee-Gees, they produce great defensive backs. Throw that in with the fact that Louis Laveau, former Carleton Raven defensive back extraordinaire, is coaching up that defensive group. It's a real like Ottawa region football love fest happening in that secondary. And a young man who is an RSEQ All-Star on the defensive line, whose name I don't have in front of me. That all in addition to a number of other key players on this defense. But it certainly has the feel, and there's some exciting stuff on offense we'll get to. Your guy, Mr. Frank in the backfield for sure. But this defense seems to be where, if you were going to highlight one thing where it's like this team is kind of special, and as we talk about year in, year out, defense is kind of what you need to build your roster around to win in the RSEQ. Concordia seems to be making the right moves in that regard.
Certainly, and I love the play from that defensive secondary in particular, so I'm happy that you highlighted that. Loic Gagné, obviously one of the CFL Combine invites going into this as well. William Castonguay, I hope I pronounced that right. As their number one tackler, I said this to you before we really started the pod. To me, having a defensive back as your number one tackler is not always the best, because that means typically those tackles are happening 5, 10, 15 yards downfield. But I don't want to take anything away from Castonguay. He finished with 50 total tackles and tackle for loss as well. So he's obviously all over the field supporting them in that regard. But they are going to need their defense to really step up and to be that main focal point. It's likely going to be the powerhouse going into next season as well. But with some of those other guys, Emilio Vidali, I think, was the other defensive lineman that you were thinking of as well. You've got a few guys here who are in their key years in order to come up and to be a part of outstanding defenses. With Castonguay looking like he's going to be moving on in that fifth-year status as well. There's a number of guys that are going to have to be replaced on this defense and just in general here. So I'm interested to see how some of these other guys can continue to step up. Obviously, we mentioned guys like Vidali and Gagné, who still have another year, depending on Gagné, at least with his the CFL and how that goes. But I think the strength of this team is going to be on that defense. And I think it was, for the most part, as well last year.
And, you know, to add on to the names of the guys that you were highlighting as well, they had some strong participation at the Invitational Combine in the likes of offensive lineman Damien Urep, defensive back Jean-Sébastien Lamotte, and long snapper Christopher Liberté, who, as a wise man once said, the ball doesn't just magically appear in the holder or the punter's hand. So, shout out to them for being able to have those guys out. I know you were obviously paying a lot of attention to all of those O-line, D-line crossover periods. I kind of put you on the spot here. Did a number 29 rocking the Concordia Stingers helmet in Mr. Urep stand out to you one way or the other?
Yeah, solid fundamentals from what I saw. Hands inside. He looked like he could move decently well. I think that the star of that, from a defensive standpoint, was the outstanding standout from Queens, Capeye. And he gave him a bit of work, if I remember correctly here. But still, I think he was a really solid offensive line. It was a solid offensive line class, but especially our boy here. And I don't know, he obviously didn't get the call up to go to the next level, but as I've been told by certain CFL scouts, that's not always an indicator for if you think somebody is really good or can make that jump. Some scouts like to be a little sneaky, a little crafty, and they'll find somebody that they like at the invitational and they'll hold on to them and not mention it to anybody else, so that when the draft comes around, they can get them at a better draft pick. So we'll see what that happens. But overall, yes, I thought he had very solid fundamentals and had certainly the potential.
Well, certainly part of a solid O-line being able to open up gaps for one, Frank Dikembe, a guy who I remember you bringing to my attention throughout the season, ends up 76 rushes, 480 yards, just one touchdown, supplementing a pretty decent rushing showing by the two quarterbacks that used in Tremblay and Ouimet. Ouimet getting 3 touchdowns as well, Tremblay adding in 1 and slightly more rushing, being at 266 yards. I don't want to talk too much about the quarterbacks because I think that deserves sort of its own, moment. But you have a guy in Dikembe, you add in a backup in Alexandre Marchand, adding in 23 rushes and just over the century mark in the actual yardage total. It's a serviceable backfield. You obviously, when you compare it to the top rushing producing teams, we're not talking about a top tier squad, but you have definitely a solid number one guy. You clearly have some talent on that O-line. And again, we will talk about the quarterbacks. And as we always discuss, that passing game supplements the run game supplements the passing game. But what was it from Dikembe that you were seeing during the season, or a moment where you're like, hey, don't necessarily get caught up in the stats necessarily. This guy has some of the goods.
Certainly. For running backs, as an offensive lineman, you'll love a dude that's willing to carry the load, fight through tackles, fight through arm tackles, and just keep running, keep doing his thing. I had a chance to watch a bit of the Concordia Sherbrooke game that was later on in the season, and just to see Dikembe fight through tackles and keep churning his feet, keep running as hard as he possibly could. I'm a sucker for hard-nosed running backs like that. So he became one of many of our guys, my guy, whatever you want to call him, but loved his tenacity. I thought his vision was fairly solid as well. He's not like he's just running into defenders unnecessarily, picking his spots. And I think one of the best attributes a running back can have is, obviously you want the vision that's there, but when you see the vision and you're waiting for that gap, and then you see a gap and you go, yeah, there's technically an arm that could be in here, but I can run through an arm tackle, and then you hit the gap as hard as you can. That's really a lot of what I saw in that Sherbrooke game on October 17th.
Now, as far as the two gentlemen that were handing the ball off to Dikembe, we obviously look to Xavier Tremblay and Antoine Ouimet. And as far as the usage between the two of them, it's kind of Tremblay getting 2 out of every 3 attempts to that other third going to Ouimet. Ouimet a little more efficient. 5 touchdowns to 2 interceptions, also adds in 3 on the ground. Tremblay, 2 touchdowns to 8 interceptions. I believe last I looked, Tremblay is going into his 4th year. Ouimet will be going into his 2nd year. So you do have that aspect. Obviously, we've talked about this we just did the Carleton podcast and we had Coach Corey Grant on, and it's clear that just different coaches have different perspectives in terms of how you leverage a more veteran player versus a more younger player, or if one player has a little bit more experience versus another player having that sort of extra change up, whether it's with their legs or something else that throws into the mix, even if they're not the most classic traditional pocket passer. And all those conversations is two quarterbacks, mean no quarterbacks, how this all flies. But it does feel like the way they use them, it almost looks a little bit more like the split between, I don't know, maybe between Aboud and McRae from 2 years ago before it clearly became Aboud's team. But they clearly like using Ouet as much as they like using Tremblay. Both of them only listed at playing in 7 games, so I don't know if there was an injury there, a piece where one just got the full start and the other's absence. We've talked about this whole multiple quarterback system. We like it when it works. We don't when it doesn't. Isn't that just playing the outcomes if I ever heard it? But what do you make of the way that they were using these two young quarterbacks this year and the potential going into this 2026 year?
Well, it seemed to me that Ume was the starting quarterback. He was the guy that they wanted to go with, but he was dealing with a few injuries last year. I think he actually left twice in the regular season because of said injuries, which is why they had to go to Tremblay. And from what I've been told, Tremblay is an incredible athlete and certainly can open up a lot of things in the run game, but doesn't have the best arm to be able to sling it around the field. So if you don't utilize a quarterback in the right way with something like that, you can get into a scenario where he's throwing 8 interceptions to just 2 touchdowns here. But I think with Ume, as long as he can stay healthy, I think he gives them certainly a decent look. I thought that the receiving core for them last year, I don't know that you would say they really outperformed by any means. I think there's certainly some room for improvement on that side of things. But with the big transfer from Darius Simmons from McGill coming over to Concordia, that gives an automatic number 1 receiver look for the Concordia Stingers in this one. If they can find a few more pieces, or if they can change the offense to complement that, where you got Simmons as that clear number 1, similar again to a Carleton situation where you've got a Tristan Reddy or a Kasim Ferdinand previously as that clear number 1, and that allows some of those other guys to really start to come out and do their thing. I think that's where Concordia could really see the best growth, especially with Frank Takembe leaving. He is in his 5th year, so I don't anticipate he'll be back unless there's a weird COVID thing, but I'm pretty sure we're done and out of that class. So I think that the passing game really needs to take a step up in order to get Concordia back into more competitive games, especially with the Lavals and the Caravan of the world.
Well, I think you bring up the Simmons transfer is major because on the one hand, this is a team where they have 3 fifth-year receivers in Robitaille, Tremblay, and Murphy, presumptively, like you said, with Takembe all moving on. But when you actually look at the production of the offense, it was young guys, first-year guys in like Revest and Kaba, who were kind of carrying the load for this team. So you add in a young guy, and as you mentioned, if Wime is the guy they want to build around to begin with, as we talked about, Marchand was that sort of second string back. And like the splits weren't really all that close in terms of the love that him and Takembe were getting, but nonetheless, he's a second-year kid. They got a couple other young kids in that backfield. If you can rely on this defense, and that's relying on whether or not Joseph is back, if Gagne is back, to begin with, I'm so sorry I'm forgetting his name for a second time, Vidali, if he's back on that D-line. It's a team where maybe you can say next year, if injuries hold up a little bit for that offense, if they're able to gel with a guy like Simmons coming in, adding in, the experience of playing with a pretty explosive offense in McGill for the last few years, these younger guys develop who already were getting the shine. It kind of has that feeling of, hey, if we lean on our defense, which as we've talked about, you got to do to begin with in that conference, and this offense can stay healthy and gel, there's something in the mix here for a team that obviously was already able to compete with a top-tier team in Laval, was taking on the team in their bracket, which is sort of McGill, so to speak. That Sherbrooke loss does stand out. The major question with not really all these teams, but I think really with Concordia and like we said with McGill is that feels like the territory where, apologies to, our friends in Sherbrooke. But that really feels like the territory where, Bishops is going to come in all of a sudden and say, Bishops, Concordia, McGill kind of duking it out in that field. And again, can you be the top dog of those and maybe give one of the two presumptive favorites a bit of a scare? And again, Laval's going to be fascinating to talk about with Arnaud moving on. Any thoughts on that with the offense, with the youth and everything like that? Or what other thoughts do you have about this club where they're at?
Yeah, I think it's going to be one of the biggest areas that I'm the most excited about going into this upcoming season is what that Bishops Gators team is going to do in the RSEQ. I think there's a lot of talk and a lot of communication around what the AUS is and how that team or those teams out there are viewed as lesser by some of the other folks across Canada because of the national semifinal performances, whatever else. If Bishops can come in and suddenly start making a push to being that number 3, number 4 spot in the RSEQ behind the two juggernauts, I think that's a huge boost to the quality of what the AUS is for sure. But I think that this is, if anything, just going to add more competition for the Concordias, McGills, and the Sherbrooks in terms of what's going to happen here. Now, there is a chance that now with this new schedule, if I remember correctly here, you are not going to play multiple teams twice. So if there's a way that you pull out a key victory from a couple teams here, suddenly those wins mean a whole lot more, whatever the case may be. A couple of those teams are going to have the two Laval and Montreal games, which that's going to be a tough deal. But depending on how that schedule shakes out, that could really make the difference for those last 4 in terms of seeding and how that's going to work here. And now there's a lot of question marks on the schedule itself. I believe last year they had 2 bye weeks. Is that going to happen again this year? They're going to take that out and go back to the old formula when Bishops was still in, or what? So there's a number of question marks about the RSEQ schedule that we'll obviously have to wait until that gets announced. But every game has always been important, but the structure of the schedule can make every game that much more important.
No, I love that you brought that up, because I don't know if the schedule makers will actually give any one team a schedule in which they only play Montreal and Laval once, or if they'll set it up so everyone has to play, everyone other than those two clubs has to play those two teams, one of those two teams at least twice. I'm coming off of doing schedule making for 3 high school basketball leagues in Toronto, so I don't want to dive into this rabbit hole again because it wasn't fun. It also makes me think about how wild the AUS is going to be, where each team is going to have to play at least 2 other teams 3 times in the season to begin with, which is going to be madness. But no, that's a really important aspect. And again, another fascinating storyline with Bishops returning, and just to see again with the success they had, how much does that transfer back? Tom, hey, shout out to the Stingers. They're a playoff team. We're purely talking playoff football teams at this point. That doesn't mean we're going to roll out the hour-long red carpet for each and every one of them. Again, this was one of the last teams. In fact, I think this was the sort of presumably last team where we're like, we're really learning quite a bit. We always learn a bit with these teams, but I feel pretty good about that. Any final thoughts on the Stingers coming off of 25, going into 26, or any of those players we discussed who are getting ready for the draft, combines, everything like that?
Well, you mentioned some of the interesting pieces on here. I just wanted to briefly touch on the coaching staff as well with these Stingers. Brad Collinson has been the head coach for the Stingers since 2018. The remarkable aspect is Concordia. He is the 6th head coach in the history of the program that dates back to 1975, which I thought was pretty outstanding. But when you look at Coach Collinson's resume here, he's got a number of really impressive feats. He was a part of the Laval Rouge or program for a number of years. He also helped coach Team Canada and on the Team Quebec teams in that same team Football Ontario type sphere. And so in his coaching resume, he has 2 international bowl titles, 4 gold medals at the Canada Cup, and 4 Vanier Cup championships. That is a pretty impressive resume, to be certain. And the quarterback coach and the offensive coordinator, a former Gale, Justin Chapdelaine as well. So that's an incredible aspect that I just wanted to point out as well. But a very clearly experienced coaching staff I think that they are going to need to certainly backfill the number of fifth-year players they had in key positions here if they want to continue to remain prevalent in this, and especially with Bishops. Obviously, Bishops has always been in Lennoxville, but having another team back in there competing for CJEP athletes, we'll see how well Coach Collinson and the rest of his staff can continue to recruit and what happens to the Stingers come 2026.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing how it all shakes out. The RSEQ is, again, with the Bishops edition, and as we talk about getting closer to the Laval pod, a team, a conference that will be very fascinating to watch. But we all live in Montreal, the Montreal Carabins world. The rest of us, we're just playing in the sandbox. Tom, fantastic job by you. We have but one more team that finished their season below 500 to get through. Certainly, you can figure that out by looking at the standings, but I'll give you a little clue. They may be my Guelph Griffins, your Guelph Griffins, everybody's Guelph Griffins. We're talking about the team from the Royal City. Tune in right here next week at the 55.